Not good. Let's see how it works. Okay, so what we learned yesterday was about the responsibilities that a husband has to his wife. And we learned about the three responsibilities of share, ksus, and oina, which refers to mizonis. A man has to support his wife. He has to buy his wife clothing, and he has to have intimacy with his wife. And the Gemara at first was discussing how do you know that he has to give mizonis, and we said that mizonis is because since he gets her earnings, which is what she would normally live off, therefore he has to give her parnasa. But the Gemara brings a brisa that has a machloikis, a three-way machloikis of what she'er, ksus, and oina are, which the Torah mandates be given to the wife. So we always understand the Pashat of Pshat is she'er means mezonos, ksus means clothing, and oina is intimacy. But we had a Tana that flips it around and says that she'er is intimacy and oina is mezonos. Ksus, everybody agrees, are clothing. But we had an interesting Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov who held that the whole pasuk, she'er, ksus, and oina are all referring to clothing. And she'er and oina are just words to describe what type of clothing he must give his wife. She'er tells you that it has to be age-appropriate clothing, and oina tells you that it has to be season-appropriate clothing. So then Zaktoisus, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, how do you know, in fact, that you have to give mizonos? So Zaktoisus, it's a kal v'chomer. Madach, you have to give a woman clothing who she can for sure survive without. Koshkin, you have to give her sustenance, which you cannot survive on, which would render it a deraisa. It's a kal v'chomer. And how do we know he has to give oina? Again, Toshis cites a kal v'chomer. Madach, he has to give her clothing, which definitely that's not the primary reason she got married for. Koshkin, he has to give her intimacy, which is the primary reason she got married for. So based on this brisa where everybody holds that there's a chiyuv deraisa to give all these three things, it's a little difficult to understand, Zaktoisus, what the Gemara said yesterday, that the mizonos is taras ma'asiyadeh, it's a tit for tat, because in fact we have a pasuk that says you have to give mizonos. And that's how Toshus ends off. And now we're up to a new Gemara. Tani Rabbi Yosy, which is 6 lines down from the top of Mem Ches Amud Aleph. No. Tani Rabbi Yosy. Tani Rabbi Yosy. You look well rested, Baruch Hashem. Tani Rabbi Yosy. She'era zu kiruv basar. She'era means that their skin touches each other. In other words, there has to be real intimacy. A man should not treat his wife like the Persians do. They are mishamish mita with their lavush. So the Muslims wear these long robes and they have a little hole cut out, but they don't actually have physical contact other than the little hole in the sheet.
There was no Islam then.
I'm sorry, I just meant that type of dress.
Okay.
The Omer Afuna, Ha'omer E Evshi, if someone says there's no way I'm going to be touching her all over, I want to be protected in my beged. This is similar to what the CDC said is any intimacy should be done with a mask, right? That's what they were saying at the beginning of the pandemic. I only wanted to no physical contact. Just let's do this surgically. The halach is Yosy v'noisim ksuba. He has to divorce his wife and give her a ksuba because clearly he's not taking care of her. So this reminds me of someone that we all know, but he's already laughing. Someone that we all know. He was a Toronto boy. David is about your age, and when his parents sent him to yeshiva, I heard this story from him himself, so I'm not making it up. When his parents sent him to yeshiva, they sent him. He was more from a Hasidic family, so his parents sent him to a yeshiva in Williamsburg. I'm not sure which yeshiva he was sent to in Williamsburg. So could you imagine in those days a 13-year-old boy all overwhelmed going out of town? His mother packed him up with whatever he would need in his suitcases. In those days, you could take suitcases on a plane. They didn't hack your China with their size. So this, he gets to New York, he opens up a suitcase to unpack into his room in yeshiva in Williamsburg, and he realizes that his mother forgot to send him linen. She sent him everything, but she forgot to send him linen. So he's a little kid, he's an innocent kid. So he calls home and he cries to his mother, Mommy, what am I going to do? I don't have linen. So she says, you're in Williamsburg. Could you imagine how many linen stores there are probably in Williamsburg? Go to a linen store, buy yourself linen, you'll be good. So he's a little kid, but turn out to it. He goes to a linen store, and it was interesting because the linen store was directly near, side by side, with a svarim store. And when you walk into the linen store, the wall in between the two stores was removed because it was a husband and wife team. A wife ran the linen store, the husband ran the svarim store, and they sort of worked together. So he comes in, and in Yiddish he says, Ich broch mich zu kaufen alalach. I have to buy a sheet. So the lady looks at him and says, Wie alt bist du, junger Mann? So he says, I'm 13 years old. She says, 13 years old, schon hast du gehabt? Oi, wei. So she says, dus kauft mir nicht du, dus kauft mir eine andere Sache, das Fuhrengeschäft. So she goes next door. Why would you buy linen in a farm store? He couldn't understand, but he followed instructions. So he goes to her husband and says, Ich broch mich alalig. So the owner of the store says, Wie alt bist du, Kind? Oi, wei. Okay, so he picks him a package and he charges him. He goes back to yeshiva. He puts the sheet on his bed and there's a hole in it. So he said all the boys around, when they saw what was going on, they were laughing at him. He was the laughing stock of the yeshiva. For 8 years, he has a sheet with a hole in it. So he runs back to the store and he says, so they said, oh, this ich was kalalach, this ich abetz lalach. And then he learned that the word lalach means laloch. He told me he's still traumatized from it, that the whole yeshiva used to make fun of him about his lalach. Okay, it wasn't such a funny story. That's a good story anyway, especially if you know who it was with. What? Do you remember? Okay, we're on YouTube now, so. Okay, huh? No, it's for real. It's for real. I can tell you who bought one when he was 13 years old in a farm store in Williamsburg. No, but what they probably do is, see, someone once told me he doesn't believe that people use it. Why? Because in Yerushalayim, everybody hangs up their laundry on the clothesline. And I never saw one of those hanging on the clothesline. Yeah. No one ever found one of those on their merpeset because it fell down from the neighbor above. But we find many other things on our merpeset. But I time to forget it. People who put them on their clothesline probably don't use them. They just hang it up so people should think. Who knows? Zog to more weiter. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, afilu ani shebi Yisrael. Even an ani shebi Yisrael has to get for his wife a nice levaya of 2 flutes and someone who's master. Zog to Gemara. If it's just Rabbi Yehuda who requires that as a minimum levaya, mechlal the Tanakama savar hani loy. Are you saying the Tanakama holds that would not be necessary? Hey Chidami, what exactly is the case? Either orcha, if it was the way that her family normally took care of these things, my time at the Tanakama. Why would the Tanakama say that a husband does not have to provide that? My time at the Tanakama don't loy. And if that's not the normal way of making a lavaya, my time at Rabbi Yehuda, why would Rabbi Yehuda mandate that? In his family, they made more elaborate funerals, and that was required, the 2 flutes and the mekoinen. The lav orcha dida, but in her family, that wasn't there. So the question is, do you upgrade her to his level? Tanakama Sover, there's a rule that if a man marries a woman and his status is higher, they fly first class, and his wife's family only fly cattle class, or better, her family schnorrers, they only fly first class, but his family flies private jet. So then the halacha is he has to treat her on his caliber. So he has to send her with private jet as well. Zoktimur, I would have thought that Hanimili Mechayim, while they're alive, yes, he has to treat her on the same status that he's used to, which she gets the upgrade. But once she dies, maybe then he doesn't have to treat her on his status, which is what Tanakama holds. If we discover, Shmuel, I don't want to repeat the same stories over and over again, but I told you a story about the root canal. A guy goes to a dentist and he says, how much is a root canal? So the dentist says a root canal is $2,500. So the guy says, $2,500? Where am I going to come up with such money? So the dentist says, listen, he says, can you find me some way to save? I can't do that. So the dentist says, how are you with pain? He says, I can handle pain. I can take it. So the dentist says, out of the $2,500, believe it or not, $1,000 is anesthesia. If you're good with pain, I can lighten up on anesthesia. I can save you $500, and then it'll only be $2,000. So the guy says, you know what? That's good. It's $500 in savings. But $2,000? How am I going to get that type of money to pay for a root canal? So the dentist says, listen, if you're really good with pain, I can do away completely with anesthesia, and then we could do this for $1,500. So he says, I love that. But $1,500, where am I going to get $1,500 from? So the dentist says, well, if you really want to save money, out of the $1,500, $1,000 is the fee of the professional to do the work, and $500 is the facility fee. I can get a student dentist who's just practicing, and there's no charge for that at all. You're being their specimen, you're being their test case. The facility fee of $500, there's nothing I can do about that. But for $500, we can do this root canal. No anesthesia, a student doing the work, but you pay a facility fee, a fee. So the guy says, great, book my wife in for tomorrow at 10 o'clock. So the Gemara says here that you have to treat your wife at least on the same level that you would treat yourself. But you can't downgrade her either. So if she's used to more, she maintains her high level. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Ukva. Halachic Rabbi Yehuda. The halachic like Rabbi Yehuda that she gets to upgrade. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Ukva. So let's stop here for 1 second and let's slide into Tosfos, because Tosfos has a very good question. The Urcha today, the Lav Urcha today. Pirish B'Kudros, the Urchei B'Vnois Mishpachtoi. What does it mean? It's his way. It means the women in his family have this minimum level of funeral. They have the two Chalilin and they have the Mekaynenis. Aval Ein Derech B'Vnois Mishpachtoi. So he comes from a higher class family where people live larger and die larger for that matter, and therefore she has to be upgraded to that level. The kosher Tosfos. What's the difference? If all we're trying to say is that they have to maintain his family's level, why do we need to give a specific example of what his family's level was? That's not relevant. All we need to know is the general category, that whatever standards he maintains for his family, that's the same standards that should be maintained for her family. Why more about Tam? The Urcha Didei means something else. It means Hainu Afilu Ani Shebi Yisrael. Even the poorest person. But that's for a man. Males get more elaborate funerals. But single females, there are those who make even less than the bare minimum funerals for single females. You're not allowed to go below the most basic funeral, even though had she not been married, if she was still a single woman, then it might have been the derech to even have a funeral that's less elaborate than the most simple funeral. Even the nisses, now that she's a married woman, she has to have the most basic funeral. So now it's a shaila already of the lowest level basic funeral, what it is, and what has to be given to her as well. That's why the Mishnah had to specify what this lowest level funeral is. When we use Tosfos, halosh and dachuk, it's still a little bit schwer in the Gemara to say that. The ka'amar kagoyin the urcha didei mashma the ikad alav urcha b'havi. By saying urcha didei is to have these two chalilim and the mekanenes, it's mashma that that's an upgrade, and others don't have that. But the way Tosfos wants to learn, we're only saying that you have to maintain the lowest level bare minimum funeral. So that's the shaila there. Okay, let's see the Gemara weiter. What happens if someone Rachman Litzlan becomes loses his faculties. Misha Nishtata. So the question is, who takes care of his children? Misha Nishtata, the law is, Bezdin Yordin Lunachasav. Bezdin, go and take his assets. Vizonin umafarnis in his ishtoi, ubanov uvanoisov. They use his assets to support his wife and his family. Vidavaracher, and they also use his assets for yet an unnamed purpose that the Gemara will discuss later. So let's see Rashi. Oh, I'm sorry. So that, okay. So Zokt Rashi. V'davar acher, l'kamon nefarish, zonin mezonis. Mefarnisin is levush uksus. So if he became a shoita, Bezdin take his assets and they're mefarnisin. Now the halacha is they're only mefarnisin based on what he himself would do. Now we learned that midaraisa, a person only has to support his children till they're 6 years old. Halacha l'maisa nowadays the derech is longer. Moshe Paskin, of course, there's a chiyuv to support your children much longer than that. I think now the chiyuv to support your children is till they become independent. So it's approximately till they become about 75 years old.
Does it say freedom 55 is when your kids are 55?
Freedom 55 is way old, ancient stuff.
No, it's when your kids turn 55.
No, I mean when your kid's 75. Okay, so Dr. Gemara. So there are those who say that if this is what he did for his children, if he was supporting his children, even above 6, when he was sane, so then you continue what you know his intent would have been, what he would have done had he been healthy. So Mishnah Shtata, Bezdin Yordin and Achasav Zonin, Umafarnish and Sishtai, Ubanu Vinosav Vidavarach. Amal Ravinu Ravashi. My Shno Meha Detanya. What's the difference between this case, where he suddenly lost his faculties, and the next case, Mishahalach Lamadinas Hayam? What happens if he goes overseas and his family's left there at home? The Ishtoi Tevas Mazonis, and the wife is saying, I need Mazonis, and my husband left, and where am I supposed to get Mazonis from? The loch is there Bezdin Yerdin Lenachasov, Vizonin, Umafarnis in his Ishtoi, Avaloy Bana Vuhunoisov, Veloy Davarach, but they will not liquidate the assets of a person to support his children and not for this other yet unnamed purpose. Amar Lei, so Rabashi answered Ravina, you don't see a clear distinction between Misha Halach Lamdinas Hayam and Misha Nishtata? Veloy Shani Loch, Ben Yoitzel Adas, Yoitzel Shaloi Ladas. Obviously, if he left willingly and he didn't make arrangements for his children, clearly he's not interested in supporting his children. But if he became a shaita, he didn't know that would happen to him. But beforehand he was supporting his children. So of course we continue on with his rotzen and continue to support his children. Let's see Rashi. V'loy shani loch yoytzei min hamokim ladas. If a guy is leaving, he's traveling, so he's going to make preparations. Haya b'yadoi letzavois al mazonis banav v'noisav v'ishtoi. He could have made specific arrangements to take care of his family. V'loy tziva, yet he didn't. Giladaita, he's clearly showing that he's not interested. Therefore, his wife, or whether or not he wants to or not, he's obliged to because of the Tnaksuba, Ishtabed Nichse. He's Nechasamar Ishtabed, and therefore we can liquidate them to support his wife. But he has no chiyuv to support his children. And therefore, if he left and he didn't make arrangements, it shows us quite clearly that he doesn't want to take care of his kids. Avol nishtata. But if someone lost his clarity of mind, the yotzim in oilam shaloiladas. I don't know if we don't necessarily know that he expected it. This happened, so we can't have expected that he would have had to make the arrangement before. If he was supporting his children up until that point, of course, his intent is. His wish would be that they should be supported them. Zok Gemara, my davarach. What is this other item that we're saying we can liquidate his assets for if he became a shaita, or well, actually, it's the shaila what it's referring to. For the first shot, we'll learn it's referring to this. But Mar Ukva said that you do liquidate his assets for davar acher. What is this davar acher that you liquidate his assets for? That means to buy his wife jewelry. Even though he's not around, he wants to buy his wife jewelry or other nice things to make her look good, or makeup. Rashi says takshet b'samim shel afkas roichel. It doesn't mean jewelry. It means perfume. B'samim shel afkas roichel shel nosim mishkashos ben. So they put on perfume. They wear nice things. That's what it's referring to. So if he becomes a shoita, we do liquidate his assets to pay for that. And Yosy Amar tzedakah. It's referring to tzedakah. For instance, if the community is raising money, we know he would have wanted to participate, so we take from his assets to give to tzedakah as well. Mandar matachshit. If you hold that you don't do a tachshit, you don't take money for a tachshit, kol shekain tzedakah, surely you would not take for tzedakah. But mandar tzedakah, if you hold that you don't liquidate for tzedakah, then aval tachshit, but maybe a tachshit javinalo. Why? The loy nichalei de tinvil. He doesn't want her to become ugly because a woman wants to take care of herself. So I actually misspoke. I said it's going on Mar Ukva. It's actually not. The first shot in Rashi is that it's going on Mishalach Lamdin Sayom, where we don't liquidate his assets for davar acher. So if we don't liquidate his assets for davar acher, if you hold it for tzedakah, yeah, maybe for tzedakah we won't liquidate his assets. But tachshit, which is closer to his heart, maybe we would liquidate his assets. But the mandamar will hold you even liquidate his assets for tzedakah, surely you'll liquidate his assets to buy tachshitim for his wife. Rashi in the second shot says that it's going on Mar Ukva, and then it flips it around. The mandamar who holds that you liquidate his assets for a tachshit doesn't necessarily hold that you liquidate his assets for tzedakah, and vice versa. Someone traveled away, and his wife died. So the question is, who's going to pay for the funeral expenses of his wife? So the halach is, Bezdin Yarden L'Nechasu. Bezdin take money from his Nechasu. And they bury her according to his honor. So that they take his assets, we know. We know that it's not ksuba that he has to bury her, and that's instead of the ksuba that he got, right? Because of the nadin, we force him to pay for her funeral. So what if her level was higher? Would you say that he can compromise and only make it his level? That's not true. Everybody holds that he has to maintain at least his wife's level of status. So it means if his level was higher, they have to take enough money from the husband's assets to give her a funeral that would be on par with what his family does. This teaches us that when we talk about how she has to be supported, it's the highest common denominator, not the lowest. So if her level was higher, she maintains her level. And if his level was higher, then she upgrades to his level. And this applies even la'achamisa. So we had a shaila earlier, who said even la'achamisa you have to maintain minimum standards, and the Rabbanan say only b'chayeha. Now, from here we see that Reb Huna is paskening that even la'achar misa, she gets to maintain the minimum of her standards and his standards. Amar Masna, ha'omer imesa loisik peru minichas. If someone says, if my wife dies, I don't want you to use my assets. Maybe he was going away, and he said, if my wife dies, you should absolutely not use the assets that I have to bury her. The halach is shaymin, you listen to him. I don't understand. What's the difference if he said don't use it? Because they're not, once he dies, so I guess he said if she dies after me, if I die and then she dies after me, don't use my assets to bury her. Well, what's the difference if he says it? The nechasim belong to the assignment, they yarshin them, and they don't have a chiyuv to bury her. What is his saying, don't use my money to bury her? Why does it have any relevance? The fact of the matter is, after he dies, the nechasim go to his assignment, and they don't have a chiyuv to bury her like he did. So what is this halacha? Ella, regardless, Yisoimim don't have to bury their mother. Ella, the case that Rav Masna really said was, Haimer Mesu. What if someone says, if I die, I don't want you to waste any of the Yerusha that I left to you on burying me. So you keep all the money to yourself and tell the Chaver Chadisha they'll have to figure out how to bury me. They'll make me into a Meis Mitzvah. So the halacha is that he said in Mesu, there you don't listen to him. Lav kol haimenu sheyasher esbonav v'yapel atzmoi alativor. He has no right to retain or to save his children's wealth, his Yerusha, and then force the tzibur to pay to bury him. I know somebody, and you know him too, a very, 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 very wealthy man, who he had his teenage children move into his next door neighbor's basement. And his next door neighbor, who was also a very wealthy man, had his teenage children move into his neighbor's basement. So they swapped children and they charged each other rent, and their children actually took welfare all their teenage years. I know this because they told me themselves. So they said, why shouldn't I collect welfare? So you have someone who's like a multimillionaire and they're collecting welfare. So Lagabi welfare, yes, Shaimanoi. What?
They weren't married?
Teenage children, yeah, not married.
Not married. Who married the house?
He had them sleep at a neighbor's house. And the neighbor reciprocated and had his kids with her. So they each paid each other rent, and then they claimed, and the kids lived off welfare. So you see from the Gemara here, maybe if there's assets there, you should use those assets. So one of the Mefarshim says that the halacha there's actually a shayla halacha. There's a shayla halacha if this only applies if a person has assets that they can use to bury him. But what if he left over nothing? What if he left over nothing? Are the children mechuyev to take from their own money to bury him? Or maybe then you could leave it to the community to bury him. So that's actually a machlokes achronim, whether or not al tzachiyv kibbur aveim, you're mechuyev to take your own money to bury your parents, or only if they left you money to do it. Now the question might be, I don't understand. Why do you have to bury? Why do you have to bury? Why should there be a chiyuv? I actually the assets. I'm mechuyev to pay my own money. So there are achronim who say that in Hilchos Yerusha, there's a reservation of the amount of money required to make the levaya that's not part of the Yerusha. It's not part of the Yerusha. That chelik of Yerusha does not go to the children. That remains earmarked to pay for the funeral. But there is a shita who holds that I'll keep it av avadi mechuyev to pay, and more than that, there's a shaila if an elaborate levaya is that yakri the shachri, is that the honor of the nifter, or is that yakri the chaye, or is that honor of the family? A big levaya makes the family look good. So according to that shita, for sure, they're mechuyev to pay for it. I'm sorry?
One thing that never took off.
What?
The value.
What are you talking about? They're very expensive. They just don't get much for it. But they're very expensive. Where's Akiva when we need him?
These are when you want to pay that way.
The Levi's are very expensive. The Levi's are the best. It used to be people spend a lot of money for elaborate Levi's. Now people spend a lot of money, they don't get elaborate Levi's. So the suppliers have it even better. Yeah. That's the kind of Levi. What are you talking about? They had a Tekon Levi. That's who was it? Rebbe Zakai who said, who's Levaz himself to be buried in very cheap Tachrichim because people couldn't afford Levi. They would just abandon the mason. Yeah. Hebrew basic burial. Zok Tehelig Mishtavaitim. La'olam. What a strong language. La'olam he b'shusav. A girl is always in the rishus of her father. Ad shetichanes until she's taken in l'rishus habal l'nesuin. Until she's taken in to the rishus of her husband for nisuin. Rashi explains. La'olam bas he b'shusav l'maynaf kamina. Then bas Yisrael murasa l'koyin. If she's a bas Yisrael and she's murasa to a koyin, where now she says kinyan kasboy and meikar din she's allowed to eat truma. Nevertheless, up the Mishnah, Eina Eichalas Betruma. She still may not eat truma until she's Nesua, until her husband takes her in. V'zakaiba kechol schus av bevitoi. And then he is completely kind to her. And then she can eat truma. So Rashi tells us that this comment in the Mishnah is referring to Hilchos Truma. Okay? Toisus has a girshav achet ikonis l'chuppah. because there's a Shiloh, what's considered going into his Rishus. Let's see what the Gemara says. Let's see what the Mishnah says about it. So she cannot eat Truma, I guess the way Rashi learns, until she's taken fully into the Rishus of her husband, L'Nesuin. And Rashi says, what does that mean? Koloyma shetichnas l'chuppah l'shem Nesuin. Shetehem Mesura l'shus habal. It's very interesting because the Mishnah is very clear in what a Kedushin consists of. Kesef, Shtar, Bia, but there's actually very little clarity in what it means, chuppah. So what it literally means, Rashi, the Mishnah is telling us, is she's coming in the Rishus Habal. And I believe there's a 5-way machlokes as to what Nesuin is. And we try to do all 5. One of them is they go into a private room together and they eat. So they actually have to eat in the Yichud room. So that's our Yichud room. There are those who hold the means when they go home together. That's the Nesuin. So the Nesuin doesn't happen until after the Chasna. There are those who learn it's when they go under a chuppah together, which is our chuppah that we do. There are those who learn it means if there's a special place designated for them, a place where they eat together, or a place where they're this year together. The chuppah might also do that. And then there's also a pshat who holds it's when she gets covered over, which would be the bedekin. And according to those shitas, that it's the bedekin, the shayla is, can you do nesuin before you can do an erison? So that's what it means. Hakdas is about. Yeah, just not turn on now. Mosar Av. Sometimes I remember to turn it on before I start, but today I didn't. In the old members. It's right when you walk into the door on the left. The code is 1836. They ask you for it. Zok the Gemara, you just have to lower the temperature. Mosar Ha'av l'shluchei abal. What happens if the shluchim of the father, if the father himself gave the woman over to the shluchim of the Baal, so that the Baal sent a delegation to pick up the kala to bring her home to his house. So then Arei B'Shus HaBaal. That's already called B'Shus HaBaal, meaning at that point, even before Nesuin, she would be able to eat Truma. What if the father was walking along with them, meaning he hasn't really relinquished her yet to the Baal? Hooray, B'Shus Av. Just lower the temperature from 70 to 68. Hooray, B'Shus Av. Mosra Shluchei Av l'Shluchei Abal. What happens if the shluchim of the father did give her over to the shluchim of the Baal? Then Hooray, B'Shus Abal. Then she's B'Shus Abal, and based on the way Rashi's learning, she's allowed to eat truma at that point. Which means even before they did Nesuin, there was just giving her over to their delegation. What does the Mishnah mean with such a strong lashon? La'olam, she's not under the rishus of the Baal until the Nesuin. My la'olam, Zaktumar lafuke mi Mishnah Rishon. The Tnan, he gives man v'lo nisu. The halach is when they make kedushin, they set a date for the Nesuin. What if the date arrives and the husband reneged? He's not ready yet to take her in. He has to already assume the expense of her mezainis, and therefore oichos mishalot. Now, since he is responsible for her mezainis, if he's a kohen, he's allowed to feed her truma. Oichos b'truma. That's what the Mishnah Rishonya says. So our Mishnah is saying no, she may not eat truma when the time comes. The designated time for the chasna comes, and the husband is not able to do the chasna at that time. You don't allow her to eat truma. Kamashan la'olam, until he actually takes her in, she may not eat truma. What is the reason why the Mishnah Achrayna said that she cannot eat truma, even though the husband already has a chiyuv to be mefarneser? There were 2 reasons offered. One reason is because if she's still living in her father's household and she's eating truma, and all of her siblings are not allowed to eat truma, she might be eating truma or drinking a glass of wine of truma, and one of her brothers will say, "Hey, that looks good. Can I taste it?" And she'll give mistakenly some truma to her family who are not kayanim, and that could be a disaster. Therefore, we don't want her to eat truma when she's in her father's household. So, based on that, it is a good argument to say that once she's given over to her husband's household, even though the actual Nisuin didn't occur, she's no longer in a situation where she might share Truma with her family who aren't Kohanim. The other reason why the Mishnah Achrona said that until Nisuin, she may not eat Truma is because until Nisuin, he hasn't inspected her. He hasn't been with her intimately. And what are we going to do if he finds a mum in her that would render his whole Kedushin a Mekach Tos, then she would have eaten Truma in the meantime wrongfully, because it's a Gloi Milsa that she was never married to a Kohen. So for these two reasons, we have to wait for the actual Nisuin. So you might ask, if it's al Tzasimpoin, so even if it's Moser, Ha'av, L'shluch Ebal, the husband still was not yet intimate with her, and if that's the case, how could we allow her to eat Truma? Maybe when they get together, he'll find a mum and it'll be a mekachos. So that they say is that once a husband takes over his wife, he would never do that unless he had already had people check her out. So he for sure had women check her out already to make sure that she's 100% flawless. Zok Tehelig Gemara. Masar Ha'av l'shluchei Abal hareyu b'shus Abal. Omer Rav. Rav said, Misirasa, when the father gives her over to the shluchim Abal, it's lakoil. All the halachas of Nisuin apply, chutz mitruma. The only restriction is that she cannot eat truma. And Rashi says lakoil, it means liyarsha. Once he gives her over, now he yarshans her already. Uli tamela. If she dies, he becomes tummy for her. Ulamaisa yadeh. Anything that she produces, her husband gets. Ulachal davar ish bisha kaima misir shluchim b'makam chuppah. Giving her over to the shluchim is exactly like a full misir l'chuppah, except for truma, because we're still afraid of simpoin. Rashi says we're still afraid of simpoin because even though she won't feed any truma to her family because she's not with her family anymore, but what if when he's intimate with her, he's finds something that's a deal breaker? In fact, it'll be Igloi Milsa that she was never married to a place. Ravasi Omer, Afu Truma. Ravasi says even for Truma. And like I said earlier, why isn't there Chash of Simpoin? Because Rashi says it's because Ravasi holds it's only because we're afraid that she'll feed Truma to her friends or her family, and that would be a problem. That wouldn't be a problem anymore because now she's not amongst her family. But Tosfos says you still have to deal with Simpoin. And for Simpoin, we'll assume that before he took her over, he would have had her checked out. Esvei, Rav Huna or Ravasi. Rav Huna asked Ravasi a question. You, Ravasi, are saying that even in Truma, once the father hands her over to the Shluchei Abal, she can eat Truma. It says in our Mishnah, and we learned Pashup Pshat in our Mishnah that it means Litruma. Litruma, until she's actually given over L'chuppah, she's not allowed to eat Truma. Yet Ravasi said that she can eat Truma even though the Chuppah didn't happen yet. She was merely given over to the Shluchim of the Baal. Amalahu Rav, so Rav told him back, Lav Amina Lachu. Didn't I tell you, Loi says Lubasar Ipcha, don't ask kashas from Mishnayos that you can easily interpret differently. Ravasi can easily answer and deflect her kasha by saying Misirasa, by giving her over to the shluchim of the Baal, Zui Knisasa L'chuppah. That's just like a Knisa L'chuppah. So don't ask me such a kasha. Ushmul Amar. Okay, so that deflects the kasha in Ravasi. So we maintain a shaila: is she given over for truma or not? Ravasi says yes, and Rav said no. Ushmul Amar. Shmuel says Li Yerushasa. When she's given over Li Yerushasa. Now, to me, and I think you would agree, it sounds like Shmuel is arguing on Rav. When Rav said Misirasa L'kol Chutz Mitruma, Shmuel seems to be limiting that further and saying it's only Li Yerushasa. That's what it seems like to me. And when I look at Rashi says Shmuel Amar Li Yerushasa Hu de Mahanya Misira. It helps that he actions her. She makes of a derech if she dies along the way. Baal Yerish Nudin the Baal is Yerish to Nadin. Davagav Damar Ishta Yerusa Mesa Eini Yarsha. Hacha here, given the Masra, once the father has given her over to the Shluchei Abal, Achuli Achal Av Mehashta, Machmas Kirv Nesuim. because the Nisun is imminent, she's already on her way. She's already in the jurisdiction of the husband, Shluchim. At that point, the father says, okay, the Natan is valid. Aval the Truma, Ula Forest Naderea, Shaloi B'Shutfis, but Lagabi Truma, and Lagabi him being made for an Adarim without the Shutfis of the husband, Ula Mitziyasa. I'm sorry, for the husband to be able to do a forest without the father, or the Mitziyasa, to keep her Mitziyah, the Eina Elamishim Eva, they're only because of Eva. Vakati lekalamechish lahachi. There's no problem of Eva here. They're not together yet. Loy mahanya mesirik yichapa. The Messiah would not help with the chuppah. So at least from this Rashi, we see that there's a difference between Rav and Shmuel. Rav said it's for everything. Shmuel is excluding mitziyasa, and he's excluding. So Shmuel saying it is considered. No, I'm sorry. So he's excluding mitziyasa and he's excluding hafaris to darel. Right? I'm not sure what Rav would hold about that, but Rashi says that Shmuel seems to be arguing with Rav at least about that. Okay. Let's go weiter. Shmuel says Liyushasoi, Rish Lakish Amar Liksubasa, to be able to keep her ksuba. Ksubasa mahi. What does it mean ksubasa? The imesa yarisla. Are you suggesting that if she dies, the husband yarshins her? Now we just learned in Rashi that if the wife dies, the husband yarshins her, even according to Shmuel, right? Rashi explains in Shmuel that kivan the masra achuli achil av mehashta machavs kirv nesuin. So how could Rish Lakish come to argue in Shmuel and say, look, Subasa, Shmuel said the same thing. That once she's given over, if she should die, the husband will yarshin her. Zakta Gemara, Amar Avina, Loimar Ksubasa me'achar mona. When Rish Lakish said that once she's given over to the Shluchei Baal, she's considered married, leading Ksubasa, that means that what happens if her husband dies now? What happens if her husband dies before she gets back there? She's still considered a Nesua, and if she marries to another man after that, she only gets a money. So even though there was no beer yet, there was no chuppah yet, but once she's given over to the Shluchei Baal, we consider her having already been married and have already been nevelas. Okay, so to Gemara weiter. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina damri tavayu misirasa lakoil af l'truma. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina hold like Rabbi Asi, who says once she's given over to the Shluchei Baal, she can even eat truma. Meisvei. So to Gemara. Halach ha'av im Shluchei Baal. Our Mishnah says the father walked along with the Shluchei Baal. Oisha halchu, but this is not our Mishnah. This is a different case. Oisha halchu Shluchei Av im Shluchei Baal. Or the Shluchim Adav are walking along with the Shluchim Baal, meaning they haven't yet relinquished her. She's still in the Rishus Adav. Or what if they're traveling on the road back to the husband's home, and Shahoshallah Chatzah B'derech, and this Kala happened to have owned the property along the way to her husband's house, and they needed to stop for the night. They were tired. It was dark. And she went into her property to spend the night with her future husband. But Rashi says that they're not going l'chuppah, they're just going to rest for the night. So the halach is, even if all of the nechasim that she was bringing into the marriage, her lawnmower, her AR-15, whatever different assets, metaltlin, she was bringing into the marriage, they were already in Beis Baila. Nevertheless, this is not considered a Nesuin and Mesa Avia Yarsha. If she would die, even after they spend the night in her property, the father Yarshins her. But Masar Avla Shluchei Baal, but if the father has already given her over the Shluchei Baal, Oisha Masar Shluchei Avla Shluchei Baal, or the Shluchin of the father already gave her over to the Shluchei Baal, Oisha Loi Chatzah B'derech, or he had a property along the way, V'nichnasa Imoi L'Shem Nesuin, and they went to spend the night, L'Shem Nesuin. Well, then you say, even though the metaltalin that she's bringing into the marriage are still in her father's property, Mesa, if she dies after that point, by Lo Yarsha. Her husband yarshins her. In other words, she's considered an Asua. By Medvar Mamurim, what do we say that she's considered an Asua? That's Lirushasa. right? We've been discussing those assets, whether they're in the father's household, whether they're in the husband's household, but that's the discussion of this brisa. Ava latruma, but latruma ein isha oichelis betruma achet ikanis l'chuppah. So the brisa says very clearly, until she actually goes l'chuppah, the woman would not eat truma. So this is a beferish upshlag to Rav Asi, who said that she gets to eat truma, and it's a beferish upshlag to Rav Yochanan and Rav Chanina, who said that she gets to eat truma. Tiyufta dechulu tiyufta. Frank Gemara. Now let's analyze the brisa itself. In one case where they went to spend the night together, it's not considered a nesua if it's her property, and where it's his property, it is considered a nesua. How do we explain that, stira? Haguvakasha. Amrit, we said nichnasa imay lalin. If she went in not to have any relations, just to spend the night because they have to rest up, they're in the middle of a journey, time of the lalin. It's only because they explicitly clarify we are just resting for the night. Hastama, if they just went into the property together without any declaration as to what their intention was, we'll say l'shem nesuin. We say by default, if they're secluding themselves in their property, it's l'shem nesuin. On the other hand, ema seifa. Look at the seifa. It says nichlas imay l'shem nesuin. If she went into his property, but dafka l'shem nesuin, then it's a nesuin. Hastama, if they went in without any explanation, lolin. So the question is, when they go into a property without declaring what they're going for, do we assume it's just to rest, or do we assume it's to make a nesuin? Omer Bashi, stami katani. Depending on the situation, the stam kamana without any clarification could mean something else. Stam chaser dida, if they're going to spend the night at her property, lolim, then we know we say the stam her das, both of her das, is just to rest for the night. And unless they speak out, this is l'nesuin, the assumption is it's lolim. Stam chaser day, but if it's his property, then we assume stam is l'nesuin. She's going into his property. That's what chup is, right? She's coming into his property. We assume stama, unless they speak out, no, we're just going to rest. Tana we learned. Mazar avlo shluchei abal v'zinsa. We know that halacha is while she's on the Rusov, she's mazana as a naira, she gets skila. But if she's a naira after nisuin, and then she's mazana, then she only gets chenek. So what if it was Masar avlo shluchei abal v'zinsa, then she was mazana, harezu b'chenek, then she only gets chenek. We consider her nesua l'gabi that. Minana mili, where do you know this from? Amar Bali Barchama Amar Kra, Liznois Beisavia, where it says she gets skila, it says why did she get skila? Because she was Liznois Beisavia. This is no longer Beisavia. She might not be totally in the household of her husband, but she's definitely no longer in Beisavia. Prat l'shamasar ab l'shluchei abal, because now she's not in Beisavia anymore. How do you know that's what we're eliminating? Prat maybe the Torah is telling you a lesser chiddush, that she's considered a naira amurasa to get skila unless she actually had chuppah. But even if she didn't have bia yet, we'll still consider that not to be beisavia. But how do you know that even before chuppah, when it's merely given over l'shluchei abal, how do you know even that's considered a nesua? Amar Rava Amar Li'ami chuppah v'edzik siva. We have a mafurish pasuk that tells us that if the girl goes l'chuppah, even though she's still a basula, there's no din skila. Why? And we had this before. Naira basula meirasalish. The Torah specifies who gets skila: a naira, a basula, meirasalish. And we're medaik. Naira v'loy boigris. If she's a boigris, she no longer gets skila, only chenek. Basula v'loy ba'ula. Only if she's a basula does she get skila. If she's a ba'ula, she does not get skila, only chenek. And meirasa v'loy nesua. So let's think about it. Why did the Torah need to tell us meirasa v'loy nesua? My nesua. If it means they had bia, well, hainu basula. We already know that from Nara basula. So what is Nesua teaching us that I wouldn't have otherwise known? Ella lav It must be that from the pasuk where it says Murasalish, it tells you that if she was nichnas l'chuppah and not nivala, she's no longer considered in her father's household. It's no longer called Beisavia, and therefore she doesn't get skila, she gets chenek. So from the extra pasuk of Liznois Beisavia, we must learn an additional woman doesn't get skila only chenek, and that's a woman who didn't even go to chuppah yet, but she was merely transferred over to the possession of the shluchei abal. That already takes her Arab Beisavia, and therefore her misa is no longer skila. Her misa, if she's mazana, will be chenek. Okay, we'll stop here, and we'll be mamshech B'ez Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.